A bully pushed a girl into the pool, knowing she couldn't swim. Everyone just watched, until a man jumped into the water. Only then did they realize she was Chuck Norris's daughter, and what happened next is something the bully will never forget. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. The morning sun rested gently over the Norris household, stretching warm light across the backyard where the preparations for the evening celebration were already underway. The house itself stood like a quiet guardian of family history, not extravagant or built to impress the world, but solid, tasteful, and full of the kind of details that made it clear it was lived in, not just owned. Inside, framed photos lined the hallway. Snapshots of birthdays, martial arts tournaments, family camping trips, and quiet, candid moments where joy was caught before anyone realized a camera was aimed at them. The world might have known Chuck Norris as a legend, but here he was simply Dad, and nothing in the house was arranged to suggest otherwise. Outside, the backyard had been transformed into a soft blend of festivity and comfort. Strings of lights were waiting to be switched on at sunset, draped like constellations in progress between the trees and the outdoor beams. A long table stood under a white canopy, still being arranged with bowls, stacked cups, plates, and flowers, freshly cut that morning. Near the pool, a portable speaker had already been tested, and silent balloons waited for air. The water in the pool lay perfectly still, catching the morning wind in tiny ripples that glittered under the sun. Emily Norris knelt beside the edge of the pool, securing a ribbon that had slipped loose from one of the corner decorations. She tugged it gently back into place, retied the knot, and let out a small breath of satisfaction. She was not the kind of girl who sought attention or tried to impress anyone with the name she carried. What mattered to her was the feeling her guests would have when they arrived, that they were welcome, safe, and appreciated. Tonight was her graduation party, but she insisted on helping, even though several of her friends had offered to do everything for her. She liked being involved, especially when something was supposed to feel sincere. Her father was only a few feet away, unfolding and locking the legs on a folding table. "That one goes near the grill," she called out to him, and he raised a hand in acknowledgement without turning, the same way he had in countless action scenes, except now he was holding furniture instead of a weapon. He moved with the kind of ease that spoke of a life spent mastering his body and knowing what mattered enough to give energy to. His back was straight, his steps quiet. There was nothing theatrical about him here. No film lights, no cameras, no applause. Just a father making sure his daughter's graduation party was perfect. "You know," he said as he finished setting the table down, "I think you spent more time tying ribbons than the store spent making them." She smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Somebody has to make sure they stay put. Besides, details matter. You taught me that." "Did I?" He squinted thoughtfully, then nodded. "Sounds like something wise. Must have been a good day." "Or a dramatic one," she teased back. He chuckled, then picked up a box of plates and carried it toward the canopy. On his way, he stopped near her. "You nervous?" "No, just excited. It feels like the end of something big, but a good end. And the start of something better," he finished for her. "That's the part people forget. Endings aren't walls, they're doors. Just make sure you decide where yours opens." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared briefly at the still surface of the pool. The water was clear, almost too clear, like it wanted her to see what it hid. Ever since she was young, water had been her one quiet fear. She had tried lessons. She had tried practice. Every time the same thing happened, a moment where the water rose too high, pressed against her face, and panic swallowed her breath before the water could. She didn't tell many people about it, and she hated the weakness it implied, but she never pretended the fear was gone. She simply worked her life around it. Her father followed her gaze and placed a hand briefly on her shoulder. Not to ask, not to insist, just to let her know he noticed. "Don't worry," she said before he could speak. "I'll stay away from it tonight. The party won't take place inside the pool anyway." He nodded, though his eyes lingered on the water for a moment longer than casual concern required. "Good, but if anything happens, I'm never more than a few feet away." "I know," she answered, and meant it. Her friends began to arrive shortly after noon to help with the last touches. Trent, tall and always slightly hunched like he wanted to take up less space, brought his camera with him out of habit. He had already warned everyone that he would be taking photos all night and wasn't going to accept refusals. May, sharp-minded and unapologetically sarcastic, showed up carrying 2 bags of chips and an opinion about everything from college applications to the current state of the playlist. Kira, quieter than both, arrived last and immediately took over the task of slicing fruit with a skill that suggested she'd done that 100 times for people she cared about. The 4 of them blended easily, the kind of ease that came from friendship built on trust, not popularity. They had survived school, pressure, rumors, projects, exams, all the little battles that added up to the larger meaning of growing up. They didn't need to impress each other. They were here because they chose to be. While helping decorate, they talked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but casually, as friends do when a celebration is near, and the world feels temporarily weightless. Beneath the jokes, though, a tension buzzed whenever the subject of school came up. It appeared quietly in the way they lowered their voices, or in the silence that followed certain names. One of those names, the name everyone avoided saying unless they had to, was Jason Brady. He was known the way storms were known. No one liked them, everyone prepared for them, and most people pretended surprise when damage followed. He wasn't just a bully, he was confident, protected, and good at finding the weaknesses of others. His father, the school principal, never saw a reason to punish him. Every complaint became a misunderstanding. Every accusation turned into a misinterpretation. Every victim was told they were exaggerating. Trent was the first to mention him that afternoon. He was tying a string of paper lanterns to a tree branch when he said without turning, "Jason's not coming, right?" "No," Emily answered immediately. The certainty in her voice was stronger than she felt. "He's not invited. I made the list. I sent the invitations personally. If he shows up, it won't be by accident." May scoffed. "He doesn't need an invitation. He only needs boredom and an audience." "He won't come," Emily repeated, quieter this time. No one argued, but no one looked entirely convinced. They all knew that Jason didn't need permission to walk into someone else's moment. He only needed the opportunity to ruin it. And for people like him, other people's joy was an open stage. Hours passed, laughter and music filled the space, and the backyard slowly transformed into a scene fit for the kind of night Emily wanted. A night that felt safe and deserved. A night that belonged to kindness instead of cruelty. The wind lifted the smell of barbecue from the grill, the sun lowered, shadows softened, and the sky began to shift from bright blue to gentle amber. As guests continued arriving with gifts, hugs, cheers, and compliments, the party felt complete. The lights flickered on, glowing like fireflies caught in a delicate web above the tables. Everything was ready. The playlist was set. The food was prepared. Emily was happy, not in the exaggerated way people often pretend to be, but in a quiet, sincere way that reached her eyes and softened her voice. Near the pool, she looked once more at the water, calm as glass. She wasn't close enough to fall. She wasn't planning to go near it later. She felt safe. She felt ready. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the surface of the water would not stay still for long. The first sign of change came as a simple shift of wind. A dropped ribbon floated into the pool. A phone vibrated with an unknown number calling. An instinctive shiver ran across her shoulders, like a warning brushing past, too soft to understand. But she ignored it. She had a party to host, and somewhere else in town, a young man who had not been invited was already deciding that he would show up anyway. Not because he was welcome, but because no one had ever made him believe he wasn't allowed. The calm before the storm had already begun. The party was in full rhythm by the time the sun dipped low enough to let the lanterns and string lights take over the atmosphere. Laughter moved through the yard like a warm current, shifting from group to group, rising and falling between conversations. Never forced, never strained. Music pulsed softly from the speakers, loud enough to fill the background, soft enough not to demand attention. Plates clinked, the grill smoked gently, and the pool reflected the glow of the lights like a second sky beneath the earth. Emily moved from guest to guest with the natural grace of someone who wasn't trying to be the center of the evening, but was its quiet anchor. Friends came up to hug her, thank her, tell her stories about classes and memories they would now file away under the past. It felt for a time like this was exactly how life was supposed to end one chapter and begin another, with gentleness, shared time, and a sense of belonging. She allowed herself to believe it would stay that way. It happened slowly at first, not with a shouted interruption or a crash, but with the subtle shift that comes when a new presence enters a space, and the air without explanation changes. People didn't stop talking all at once. Instead, the sound dimmed in fragments. One conversation hesitated, another went quiet. A third voice trailed off mid-sentence. It was like a ripple passing quietly through the crowd, noticed but not yet understood. Then eyes began to turn toward the entrance of the backyard. Jason Brady was walking in. He didn't arrive alone. Two of his usual followers came behind him, dressed in clothes that cost more than they looked like they were worth, wearing expressions that said they hadn't come for friendship or celebration. Jason himself walked as if he were stepping into a room already filled with applause. His shoulders leaned slightly back, his chin lifted, his smile practiced. It wasn't joy. It was ownership, the smug assumption that any place he entered became his. He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. The silence that followed his entrance was loud enough to count as acknowledgement. Emily saw him and felt her stomach tighten. Not with fear, exactly, but with a sudden awareness that something precious had just been touched by the wrong hands. She stepped forward immediately, not running, but not delaying either. Her voice stayed calm, measured, not panicked, as if confidence itself could prevent escalation. "Jason," she said, stopping in front of him and blocking the path toward the core of the party. "You weren't invited. You need to leave." He looked at her with an expression that tried to blend amusement and superiority. "I know," he answered, as if that were the most unimportant detail in the world. "But you're having a party, and I thought you'd want the most memorable part of your school experience here." "That's not what this party is," she replied, still steady. "You weren't invited. This is not your space. I'm asking you to go." One of his friends let out a low snicker. "She thinks she can tell you where to stand." The other added, "What are you going to do, Norris? Call your daddy?" Jason grinned wider, emboldened by the echo behind him. "Relax," he said, stepping slightly to the side, trying to see past her toward the group of guests pretending not to watch. "I just came to have a little fun. Didn't know joy was off limits here." "You didn't come for fun," she answered. "You came to provoke. Everyone here knows why." "Everyone?" He raised an eyebrow and looked around. Several guests instantly dropped their gaze, pretending to be absorbed in their food or phones. The silence was answer enough. "Funny. Doesn't look like anyone's rushing to say that to my face." It was true, and that was the problem. No one moved to support her, not because they agreed with Jason, not because they didn't care, but because they knew exactly how power worked in their world. Jason didn't need to be right to win. He just needed people to be afraid of the consequences of opposing him. For years, he had made sure they were. Emily held her ground anyway. "You need to leave," she said again. "This is my home. I'm not negotiating that." Jason stepped a little closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she and those immediately near them could hear. "You're brave tonight," he said, tone sharpening like a knife. "Should I guess why? 'Cause Daddy's here? Because this is home turf? You think that changes the way things work?" Before she could answer, he turned away from her and walked straight into the center of the yard, forcing the crowd to part around him. He didn't walk like someone entering a celebration. He walked like someone entering a cage he knew no one else could survive with him. The humiliation began immediately, small at first, like he was warming up. He commented on outfits, exaggerated people's fears, laughed at inside jokes no one wanted revived. He approached Trent, tapped his camera, and loudly announced, "Still hiding behind lenses so people don't see you shaking in real life?" Trent froze. He had been bullied by Jason before, but not in front of this many people. Mai stepped in, sharp as always. "You must be exhausted, Jason," she said. "Being disliked takes a lot of energy. Even parasites need a host to survive." A few people laughed, not loudly but enough for Jason to hear. His eyes flicked toward her with a glint that was not amusement. "You always had the loudest mouth in the room," he said. "Shame it never came with a spine." The words didn't cut her, but they changed the air. Everyone felt it. Emily appeared again, this time with more firmness, less diplomacy. Jason, I'm asking you one last time. Leave now. He didn't even turn toward her. You really think you get the last word? Because your name is Norris? That has nothing to do with it, she answered. Oh, it has everything to do with it. He finally faced her fully. You think being his daughter means you get to decide the rules? No. It just means you grew up never being told no. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he suddenly shifted his posture, took several long steps toward the poolside and stopped near the edge where a few guests were sitting. The movements were too casual, too directed, like a predator choosing where to strike. Somewhere in the crowd, a few people exchanged uneasy glances. They already sensed where this was going, but they stood still, hoping, selfishly, that whatever was about to happen wouldn't involve them. Jason leaned down, picked up an unopened soda can from the grass, and tossed it lightly into the pool, watching it bob on the surface. Nice setup, he said. Would be a shame if someone ruined the mood. Nobody moved, nobody laughed. That was the first moment the party felt like it wasn't really a party anymore. It was a room full of people waiting for something to go wrong. Emily stepped forward, but he didn't let her speak this time. Tell you what, he said, voice sharp as a match pulled across a striking pad. Why don't you prove you actually have control here? Make me leave. Go on. You wanted to be in charge. She didn't back away. I'm not playing a game with you. He smiled, not because he enjoyed conversation, but because he knew he had finally reached the part of the evening he came for. Then someone else will. And for the first time that night, the pool water seemed to reflect something other than lights. It reflected threat. The tension was no longer subtle. It was thick enough that even the air between people felt heavier. Some guests shifted their weight, restless. Some stepped back. Some quietly took out their phones, but not to take photos, to be ready, just in case. Jason wasn't leaving. He was just getting started. And whether anyone liked it or not, the night was already steering towards something no one at the party would forget. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was about to become terrifying. The calm had broken. The storm had entered the yard, and it wasn't going away on its own. The pool waited like a silent witness. The night was changing shape, and the moment of impact was coming next. The silence that settled over the backyard was not the comfortable kind that happened when music paused or when people quietly watched fireworks. It was the strained, fragile silence that forms when a crowd senses danger but doesn't yet know how to respond. Conversations had stopped entirely now. Even the light seemed dimmer, though nothing in the wiring had changed. The air itself felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the night were holding its breath. Jason stood near the edge of the pool, facing the watching crowd like a performer, waiting for applause that he hadn't earned but fully expected. His friends positioned themselves at his back, not speaking, but ready. They were the kind of followers who didn't have courage of their own, but fed on borrowed confidence, men who smirked when someone else was pushed, because it was safer than being the one pushed. The crowd wasn't looking at them, though. Everyone's eyes were on Jason, waiting, dreading. Emily approached again, no longer trying to hide her rising frustration. Enough, she said, and her voice didn't shake. She had been raised to face things, not run from them. You've made your point, whatever it is. Now leave. Jason tilted his head and studied her, like someone examining an object that had stopped being interesting. I don't think I've made my point yet, he said almost thoughtfully. Not until everyone sees something real. Then he turned his gaze to the pool again, the water reflecting light in shifting fragments against his shoes. Somewhere behind Emily, someone whispered, "He's not serious." But their voice held the kind of disbelief that was really fear in disguise. Jason stepped closer to the pool's edge, then turned around abruptly and took 3 long strides toward Emily. Before she had time to step back, he grabbed her wrist not tightly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away without making a scene he could mock. You like pretending you're in charge? He asked. Like people listen to you? She tried to pull free. Let go of me. Or what? He asked, grinning. You'll call your father? You'll cry? You'll ask people to help you? His voice dropped lower. No one here wants to be the one who steps in. They're all hoping I pick somebody else. He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. She looked at the faces around her. People she cared about. People who cared about her. People who were kind in normal circumstances. But none of them moved. They didn't want her hurt. They didn't want to watch this. But the fear of crossing Jason, of becoming his next target, froze them in place. That knowledge stung worse than anything Jason had ever said. She pulled again. "Let me go." Jason let her wrist slip from his hand, but before she could step away, he used both palms and shoved her hard in the chest. The motion was fast. No warning, no pause. Just a sudden force and a gasp that barely formed before she was falling backward. The world tilted. The lights swung. The blue of the water rushed upward. Then the cold hit. She plunged into the pool, water swallowing her whole. The shock was instant, a full-body grip that froze her lungs before she could scream. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the terror. The same terror she had known since childhood. The one that didn't need words because it lived in her muscles, in her memory, in the deep place the mind keeps fear when it's too big to reason with. The surface closed over her head, and the world became soundless except for the muffled roar of her own heartbeat. Her body began to thrash instinct, not training. Her hands reached for something, anything, but the water was everywhere and nowhere. She couldn't tell which way was up. She couldn't breathe. She tried to fight the weight pulling her downward, but the panic was already in control, tightening her chest, making every movement frantic instead of purposeful. The pool lights shimmered near the surface above her, blurred by the water. She could see them, but they looked like distant stars, unreachable. Her legs kicked, her arms pushed, but she wasn't rising. She was sinking. Above the water, the first sound was a scream, not from her, but from someone watching. Then came more. Some gasped, some cursed, some stepped forward in horror. Phones came out, hands went to mouths, eyes widened. Jason laughed. Not loudly, not hysterically. Just enough for everyone near him to hear, enough to make his pleasure unmistakable. One of his friends muttered, "Dude," but didn't move to stop anything. May shouted, "Are you insane? She can't swim." Jason didn't turn. "Maybe she'll learn," he said, and then added, "Or maybe not." Trent took a step toward the pool, then stopped, trembling. He wanted to jump in. He did, but he didn't know how to react fast enough, and the fear of Jason, fear of doing it wrong, fear of everything locked his knees. Another guest ran to look for something to pull her out with a pole, a float, anything. But there was nothing nearby, nothing except water and shock and time slipping away. And then, movement fast, sudden, cutting through the paralysis of the crowd. Chuck Norris was already running. He had seen it all. He had heard the splash. He didn't shout, didn't waste a second calling for help, didn't demand answers or give warnings. He just moved. The world seemed to slow as he sprinted, shoes pounding against the pavement. He reached the edge of the pool in 3 long steps and dove, without stopping, without hesitation, without breaking motion. His body sliced through the water cleanly, barely making a splash, and the shock of cold didn't touch him. There was no room for that. Not now. Only one thing mattered. He reached her in seconds. She was below the surface, eyes wide, losing air. His arm wrapped around her torso, securing her head above the water, and he kicked upward with controlled force. As soon as they broke the surface, she gasped, coughing, choking, water spilling from her lips. He lifted her onto the edge of the pool with the calculated strength of someone who had trained his entire life not just to fight, but to save. People rushed forward now, not to help Jason, not to defend him, but to help her. Towels, jackets, hands, all reaching, all trembling. Her breath was fast and uneven, tears and water mixing on her face. But she was breathing. She was alive. She clung to her father without speaking, without needing to. Chuck didn't speak either. He didn't need to. He looked at his daughter for 3 long seconds, confirming she was conscious, stable, not in immediate medical danger. Then he stood. Water dripped down his clothes, pooling at his feet. His expression was not rage, not the loud, explosive kind that burned quickly and vanished. It was something far colder, controlled, focused. A quiet fury built from the knowledge that someone had tried to harm what he loved. The crowd felt it. Something shifted as he stepped forward. Something in the air, in the balance of power, in the collective understanding of what was about to happen. Jason, for once, didn't smile. He was still leaning near the pool when Chuck walked toward him. The laughter that had filled his voice minutes earlier was gone, replaced by the first ripple of uncertainty. He straightened, tried to keep his posture confident, but something in him flickered. The smirking arrogance was still there, but thinner now, stretched tight over something that looked suspiciously like doubt. "Hey," Jason said, lifting his hand slightly. "It was just a joke. She's fine. No harm done." Chuck stopped in front of him, still dripping, his clothes clinging to him like armor. His voice came out quiet, too quiet. "You put my daughter's life in danger." Jason's answer came too fast, too rehearsed. "She fell. I barely touched." "You shoved her," Chuck said. "Everyone saw it." Jason swallowed, and for the first time since arriving, his eyes darted left, right, toward the crowd, toward his friends, toward escape routes that did not exist. The crowd wasn't silent anymore. They weren't frozen. Something had been broken, not by the shove, but by the rescue. People who had thought they were powerless now saw clearly that Jason wasn't invincible. His power only worked when others stayed quiet. Tonight, they weren't quiet. Trent's phone was still recording. May had already called 911. Someone else was speaking loudly about witnesses. People were talking not in whispers, but openly, angrily, like a wall had finally cracked. Chuck took one more step forward. "You're going to answer for what you did," he said, calm. "Absolute." And then before anyone else could move, before Jason could retreat, before his friends could shield him, before the police arrived and the night turned into testimony and legal language, the lesson was about to begin. A lesson not in violence but in consequence. A lesson Jason Brady had never learned, but was about to. The yard was still dripping with tension, as heavy as the water that clung to Chuck's clothes. The lights shimmered against the pool, rippling over the surface that only moments ago had nearly swallowed his daughter. Emily sat wrapped in a towel now, coughing softly, her friends clustered protectively around her. Their faces were pale, a mix of guilt and relief. The laughter and music that had once filled the air were gone. The party, the celebration, the warmth, all of it had vanished into a silence that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the backyard. Chuck took a step closer to Jason, his boots pressing into the wet tiles with slow, deliberate weight. Every movement he made felt heavier than sound. Jason's usual mask of superiority faltered. He straightened, forced a smirk, and tried to rebuild his confidence. "You think you can touch me?" he said, voice shaky despite the bravado. "My father—" Chuck's gaze cut him off. It wasn't rage or loud fury. It was calm. The kind of calm that was infinitely more dangerous because it didn't need to shout. He took another step, closing the distance. Jason's friends shifted behind him, uncertain whether to stay or flee. One of them muttered, "Let's just go, man." But Jason, trapped between pride and panic, stayed rooted. "You shoved my daughter," Chuck said. The words came out evenly, every syllable measured. "You thought it was a joke. You thought you could humiliate her in front of people who were too afraid to stop you." His voice grew colder, not louder. "That ends now." Jason tried to laugh. It came out thin and dry. "You don't scare me, old man. You touch me. You'll regret it." "Maybe," Chuck said, "but not as much as you will." Jason swung first, a reflex born from arrogance, not skill. Chuck moved slightly to the side, effortless, precise, like shifting through air. The punch passed harmlessly, and before Jason realized his mistake, Chuck caught his wrist and turned it sharply, guiding the motion downward. The young man dropped to one knee, gasping from pain rather than impact. Chuck didn't hit him. He didn't need to. Every movement was control, not of anger, but of balance. His strength was the quiet kind that knew exactly how much to use. Never more. Jason tried again, throwing his other arm toward Chuck's chest. This time Chuck caught him mid-swing, using his own momentum against him. A second later, Jason was flat on the ground, staring up at the night sky, blinking against the lights that blurred above him. The crowd gasped but didn't intervene. It wasn't a fight. It was a demonstration. The kind of lesson that words could never teach. "Get up," Chuck said. Jason hesitated, then scrambled to his feet, chest heaving, face red with humiliation. His friends had backed away now, watching silently. Their courage evaporated. He shouted, "You can't do this! You'll go to jail for assault." Chuck's expression didn't change. "You think I'm the one on trial here?" He stepped closer again, and Jason stumbled backward, his shoes slipping slightly on the wet tiles. Chuck didn't advance further. He simply stood there, commanding the air with stillness alone. "You've spent your life thinking you can hurt people because no one ever made you face what that means. That ends tonight." His tone dropped low, quiet enough that only Jason could hear the next words. "You're going to live with this moment, because from now on, every time you try to scare someone, you'll remember the night you learned what real strength looks like." Jason said nothing. His hands trembled. Behind him, the crowd was completely silent, and for the first time, the laughter that had always followed his cruelty was gone. He looked around, searching for the usual approval, the familiar smirks of those who admired his power. There were none. Every face around the pool was turned against him. Even his friends wouldn't meet his eyes. The sound of sirens broke the silence, faint at first, then growing louder. The flashing red and blue lights soon spilled across the fence as a police car stopped in front of the house. Someone, probably Mea, had called them minutes ago, and now the world was ready to witness what came next. Chuck didn't move as the officers entered the yard. "Over here," he said simply, pointing toward Jason, whose face had gone pale. "That's the one who pushed my daughter into the water." Jason's mouth opened, but no words came. He tried to speak, but all he managed was a weak shake of his head. "It was an accident," he said finally, though his voice cracked halfway through the lie. "I didn't mean—" One of the officers, a tall woman with sharp eyes, cut him off. "We'll hear everyone's statements," she said, pulling out a small notepad. "But from what I'm seeing, there are plenty of witnesses." Trent stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I have a video," he said. His voice shook slightly, but his hand didn't. "It shows everything." Jason's face drained of color. "Delete it," he demanded, turning to the boy. "You can't—" Chuck's voice cut through. "He's not deleting anything." The officer nodded. "Good, that'll help." Jason's composure collapsed completely then. He backed away from the pool, muttering something under his breath that no one caught. His two friends were already at the gate, trying to disappear before the questions started, but the other officer stopped them. "You're staying. You saw what happened." For several long minutes, the yard became a blur of activity. Officers talking to witnesses, guests giving statements, the flashing lights painting the water in alternating red and blue. Emily sat quietly through it all, leaning against her father's arm, still wrapped in the towel. Every few moments he looked down at her, just to make sure she was breathing steadily. She was, but her eyes, though open, stared past the scene, distant. Shock had softened her into stillness. Jason stood near the officers now, no longer defiant, just small. He kept trying to catch his father's name like a shield. "My dad's the principal," he said more than once. "He'll fix this. You'll see." Chuck finally turned toward him one last time. "Your father can't fix what you broke tonight," he said. "Not anymore." The officers led Jason toward the car, not yet arresting him, but keeping him under watch. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring to each other in hushed tones. The party was over, but no one wanted to leave just yet. They stood in small clusters, processing what they'd seen, the cruelty, the near tragedy, the quiet justice that had followed. For the first time, Jason Brady had no power here. And for the first time, the people who had once been afraid of him felt something else in his place: relief. Chuck helped Emily to her feet and guided her gently toward the house. She was shivering, her voice barely audible. "I didn't think anyone would help me," she said quietly. "Everyone just froze." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "They will next time," he said, "because they saw what silence costs." She nodded, leaning into him as they walked inside. The flashing lights outside painted brief streaks of color on the walls as they passed. Behind them, the pool was still again, the water calm, reflecting nothing but the stars. The night wasn't over, not yet. There was more to face, more to be said, and soon enough there would be another confrontation. One not with a spoiled teenager, but with the man who had made him that way. The father was coming, and when he did, he would find a truth he could no longer deny. The flashing lights from the police cars still washed across the quiet neighborhood long after Jason had been separated from the crowd and questioned. Most of the guests remained in the yard, not because the party continued, but because leaving felt somehow unfinished, as if walking away too soon meant pretending nothing had happened. They stood in small clusters, some speaking in low voices, some replaying the scene again and again in their minds, some simply staring into the still water, unable to forget the image of Emily sinking beneath it. Others sat on the grass in thoughtful silence, stunned not only by what Jason had done, but by their own inaction. The shame of it lingered in the air like smoke. Inside the house, Emily had warmed up, wrapped in dry clothes and resting under a blanket on the living room couch. She wasn't crying anymore, but she wasn't speaking either. Her eyes were open, but they looked far away, as if she were still underwater and searching for the surface. Chuck sat near her, not hovering, not crowding her, just being present. He knew the difference between what could be fixed and what needed time. She was breathing normally again, but her silence was thick with exhaustion. Not of the body, but the spirit, the kind that followed humiliation, fear, and survival all at once. Every few minutes, Chuck glanced toward the window. He could sense what was coming long before he heard it, the low rumble of an engine approaching, the tightening of voices outside, the shift in the atmosphere that signaled another disturbance. Not physical, but moral. The kind that arrived not with fists raised, but with indignation sharpened into arrogance. A silver sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights slicing through the blue pulse of the police strobes. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out, dressed in a suit that didn't belong in a residential street at night. The posture, the expression, the purposeful stride, all of it belonged to a man who had never been forced to justify his authority. That man was Principal Robert Brady, father of Jason Brady and the architect of the shield that had protected his son for years. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, as if he had been interrupted from something important and expected to resolve this quickly, cleanly, and without challenge. He scanned the scene, the guests, the police, the pool, the lingering tension. His gaze did not linger on anyone's suffering. It searched only for the one thing he wanted, his son. When he didn't immediately spot him, he walked straight toward the nearest officer, shoulders squared, chin raised. "What is going on here?" he demanded, voice sharp and cutting. "I received a message that my son was being detained. I expect an explanation, and I expect it now." The officer didn't flinch. "Your son is being questioned regarding an assault." "Assault?" Robert repeated, scoffing. "My son doesn't assault people. He's a student, a minor, and this," he gestured dismissively toward the backyard, "is clearly some kind of misunderstanding." Several of the guests exchanged looks, the kind of looks that had been silent for years, the kind that said, "There he is, the reason Jason never pays for anything, the reason we were always afraid." Robert saw the faces and mistook their silence for uncertainty. He raised his voice slightly, making sure every officer present heard him. "My son is not a criminal. I've spent years managing children who make up stories to avoid the consequences of their own mistakes. I expect you to release him immediately." The officer stared at him evenly. "We don't release anyone until we've gathered witness statements." "Oh, I'm sure the witnesses are very emotional right now," Robert replied, tone dripping with insinuation. "Parties, teenagers, noise, alcohol, peer pressure. It wouldn't be the first time a situation was exaggerated." The officer was about to respond, but another voice interrupted, calm, deep, and steady. "He pushed my daughter into the pool knowing she couldn't swim. That's not exaggeration." Robert turned sharply. Chuck Norris stood only a few steps away, arms folded, still wearing the same clothes he had jumped into the water with, though they had dried enough to cling stiffly to him. There was no aggression in his expression, only truth, spoken like something that required no persuasion. For a moment, Robert didn't speak. He just looked at him, his brain processing the fact that the man in front of him was not another teacher, not a student, not someone he could bluff or intimidate into silence. His reply came slower this time, measured, cautious. "Mr. Norris," he said, shifting tone as if adjusting settings on a machine, I'm certain this was all a misunderstanding. Jason may have behaved immaturely, but he would never intentionally put someone's life at risk. He laughed while she was drowning, Chuck said. That sentence didn't need to be loud. It broke through every remaining excuse Robert had been preparing. There was a long silence. People stopped pretending to talk. Phones lowered. The crowd shifted almost collectively toward one center of gravity: truth. Robert searched the faces around him, expecting at least a few to look away, to show fear, to shrink back from judgment the way they always had at school meetings. But this time no one did. May stepped forward, arms crossed. Trent held his phone up in plain view. A few parents who had come to pick up their children joined the circle, their expressions now stiff with anger. Anger not at Chuck, but at the years they had been forced to keep quiet while Robert protected his son, and by extension, himself. People here have recordings, Chuck continued. More than one. They saw what happened. They heard what was said. Nothing was misunderstood. Jason, who had been standing several feet away with an officer, finally broke his silence. Dad, he said, voice brittle, they're blowing it out of... Robert cut him off sharply, not because he believed him, but because control, his control, was slipping, and he could feel it. He needed to re-establish authority, and the only tool he had ever relied on was denial. No one is watching those videos, he said, raising his voice, directing it at the officer now. They were recorded without consent. That makes them inadmissible. Not when it's evidence of a crime, the officer replied. Jason's mouth opened slightly, eyes widening, because that was the first time the word crime had been used in reference to him. All his life, consequences had been conversations, warnings, meetings, not laws. Robert inhaled, adjusting again. If anyone posts those videos online, I will sue for defamation, emotional damage, illegal distribution. You don't get to threaten people into silence anymore, Chuck said. His voice wasn't angry. It was disappointed. Not in the man, but in the father. Your son didn't become what he is by accident. You built that. A sharp exhale left Robert's nose like steam leaving cracking metal. He looked at the crowd again, but the room of silence he used to command had vanished. He looked at the police, but they weren't bending. He looked at Jason, and for the first time saw not a son being unfairly accused, but a reflection, the worst possible reflection, of the man raising him. Something inside him cracked, not visibly, not loudly, but enough that the mask he wore slipped for a moment. The first flicker of powerlessness crossed his face. It didn't make him kinder. It only made him angrier. This isn't over, he said. I'll be filing complaints. I'll have the board review. It's already over, Chuck replied. You just don't like the ending. The officer stepped in then, not with aggression, but structure. Mr. Brady, we'll be taking your son in for processing. He won't be held overnight, but there will be charges, and you'll be notified when to appear in court. Jason inhaled sharply, as if the words themselves cut his lungs. Court, he whispered. You said you'd fix this. Robert didn't answer. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. The weight of the consequences had stopped being negotiable. Statements finished. Evidence collected. Witness lists confirmed. When the officers led Jason toward the car, no one flinched, no one interrupted, no one begged to ease the moment. Some of the guests watched with quiet vindication, others with sadness. Not for him, but for the years he had stolen from others. Only when the car doors closed and the red and blue lights faded from the street did the yard finally exhale, a long, slow breath that tasted like something painful, but also necessary. Justice hadn't finished, but for the first time in years it had started. Robert remained standing alone for a moment, staring at the space where his son had been. Then, without a word to anyone, he walked back to his car and drove away. No one stopped him. He had already lost. And tomorrow, for the first time, the school, the system, the silence, the fear, would have to face the truth he could no longer bury. But tonight, in the quiet behind the storm, something else began to bloom. Not celebration, not cheerfulness, but the beginning of healing. And for Emily, for her friends, for every student who had swallowed pain in silence, the world had tilted, just a little, in the right direction. Not because someone fought back with cruelty, but because someone finally said enough and meant it. By the time the last police car left the street, the night had settled into a stillness that felt different from the calm that had existed before the party began. This quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the silence that follows a storm, when the air is too heavy to hold more noise and too raw to pretend nothing has happened. The guests who remained lingered, hesitant to leave Emily or her family alone, unsure if their presence was comfort or apology. One by one, they approached her before going home, some offering hugs, some offering words, some simply squeezing her hand and letting the silence speak for what they couldn't. No one tried to pretend the night had gone mostly fine. No one tried to hide behind excuses anymore. Everyone knew that something fundamental had changed, not only for Emily, not only for Jason, but for every person who had spent years believing that silence was a form of safety. Their faces showed the shock of realizing the truth. Silence wasn't protection. It had been permission. Inside the house, Emily sat quietly on the couch, still wrapped in the soft blanket, but more awake now, more aware of the world around her. Her breathing had steadied. Her hands had stopped shaking. The panic had settled, leaving behind a different emotion, one far quieter, far heavier. Grief, not for what had happened, but for what it meant. She had never wanted a night like this. She had wanted a celebration, a memory filled with warmth. But the night had chosen something else for her, something she hadn't asked for but would now have to live with, a story of survival. Chuck sat beside her, his presence as steady as ever. He didn't speak unless she did. He didn't force comfort. He knew the difference between saving someone from drowning and helping them learn how to breathe again afterward. The first was about instinct. The second was about patience. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I thought no one was ever going to move," she said. "I thought I was going to drown in front of everyone I knew." Chuck turned his head to look at her. "You didn't," he said. "You're here. You're alive. And they're not going to forget that moment ever." She nodded slowly. "I don't want them to forget. I want them to remember they did nothing. I wanted to change something." Chuck's eyes held hers for a moment. Then he gave a small, approving nod. "It already has." Over the next few days, the consequences began, not with fanfare or instant justice, but with the steady unfolding of truth. The school board received formal complaints from multiple families, not just about the incident at the party, but about the years of ignored reports, silenced victims, and favoritism that had let Jason Brady act without fear of punishment. Videos were submitted as evidence, not leaked online as revenge. The students who had once been too afraid to speak began sending statements, some short, some pages long, some describing things no one had ever heard before. What had been a whispered rumor about the principal protecting his son became a documented pattern of misconduct. Jason was removed from school. Not suspended, not warned, removed. He faced mandatory court-ordered counseling and community service. He wasn't sent to jail, but he was finally sent somewhere he had never been before. Consequence: Robert Brady was placed under investigation. His authority at the school was stripped, not temporarily, but permanently. It turned out that the moment he feared most was not losing power, but being seen clearly at last, without the shield of reputation, title, or control. The board issued a public statement about transparency. Local parents demanded new oversight policies. A district review was scheduled. The silence that had once protected him had fractured into something loud enough to be heard far beyond the walls of the school. Change didn't come dramatically. It came steadily, like a locked door finally accepting that it had to open. For Emily, the healing was slower, not dramatic, not immediate, not something she could mark on a calendar. She went to her follow-up appointment. She walked near the pool, sometimes staring at the water for long stretches without going any closer. She didn't try to swim. She didn't pretend the fear was gone. But the panic no longer felt like a trap. It felt like something she could stand beside without being pulled in. One afternoon, she went outside with a notebook and sat near the pool. Not close enough to touch the water, not far enough to avoid it. She wrote down everything she remembered, not just the fear, but the details of what people did and didn't do. When she was done, she closed the notebook and placed it beside her, as if leaving a piece of the night there for the water to witness. She didn't say it aloud, but the act itself said enough. I won't pretend this didn't happen, but I won't let it define me either. Her friends visited often, not with guilt anymore, but with intention. Trent printed out a photograph he'd taken before everything went wrong. The lights over the pool, the laughter, the decorations before they meant something else. He handed it to her and said, "This is still part of the night too." May brought a new playlist she'd made called Recovery is Rebellion and pretended it was a joke, though the last track was titled Breathe. Kira knitted her a scarf in the same shade as the blanket she'd wrapped around herself after being pulled from the water. None of them said, "I'm sorry I didn't jump in." They didn't have to. Their presence was already the apology and the answer. A week later, the backyard lights were turned on again. Not for a party, not for a crowd, just for a quiet evening with a few people she trusted, sitting together, eating leftover snacks and talking about college, futures, and the strange way life could break and still continue. Chuck stood by the grill, flipping food with the same calm as always, but he kept glancing toward Emily. Not with worry anymore, but with pride. The kind a father feels when his child has walked through something dark and still stands with her head upright. Emily met his eyes once and smiled. A real smile this time, tired but unbroken. The pool was still. The lights reflected softly across the surface. The night felt different now, not because danger was gone, but because truth had taken its place. What had happened would never be forgotten, but neither would what followed. The fear had changed people, yes, but so had the courage. And someday, maybe not soon, but someday, Emily would step into that water, not to erase the past, but to prove she survived it. Because strength wasn't something she got from being a Norris. It was something she earned the moment she refused to drown in silence. And now she wasn't afraid of the water being deep. She was only afraid of living shallow,